Laura, and the conference organizers. I'm delighted to be here. Also delighted to see so many of you working and interested on mobile phones in the developing world, or Global South, as I prefer to call it. My talk, I suppose, thanks also to John for such a clear lecture on social change, and I'll be in my talk also picking up on some issues, obviously, as can be expected, though from a slightly different angle. And I suppose I pitched my talk to, well, in response to this unease I have with a wider mobile-induced optimism, but I hope I won't pass as a pessimist, because I surely am not. But also, the idea of my talk is really to kind of try and suggest some of the contributions that anthropology can make to our understanding of new media. I start with an encounter I had during a follow-up trip in Jyväskylä, which is the city where I conducted my doctoral research on mobile phone use among young people. And after spending 2 years there, I went back to England and then came back for a short trip. And this old man, known as the Takdir, called me over. And he used to be my neighbor, so we knew each other quite well. And he looked really concerned, and he said, "Oh, they've had to send you back. Oh, that's terrible. You know, I'll help you. I'll give you the answer to your research." And he gave me a tap on the back, and he said, "You know, some people say that mobile phones help with development, but that's not true. Mobile phones here, young people use their phones to namorar, which in Portuguese means to date, to develop intimate relationships." He said, you know, some say the phone is for business, but, you know, that's not true. Of course, young people in Jyväskylä use their phone to do various things, whether it's to keep connected with relatives, to inquire about this or that, or even to light up their way at night. But as Takdir pointed out, very often they use their phones to namorar, so to flirt, persuade, impress lovers, manage relationships, or coordinate romantic meetings. And I start with this vignette from my fieldwork to introduce much wider issues pertaining to mobile epistemologies, to the different ways in which knowledge on mobile communication and new media more generally is acquired and produced, and to propose ways to make sense of competing regimes of truth. So in this case, between Takdir's assessment, between the ICT4D perspective, also between Takdir's understanding of the ICT4D perspective, and my own theoretical inclinations as a researcher, and perhaps more specifically as a social anthropologist. The enthusiastic adoption of mobile phones throughout the world, including in places on the margins of neoliberal capitalism, has captured the imagination of scholars, lay observers, investors, and policymakers alike. And although these different actors may share an interest in this ubiquitous technology, they all approach it with their own particular lens. In other words, they'll have their privileged methodologies, pose questions in particular ways, have their own genealogies, objectives, even vocabularies, and criteria of validity. And although these different approaches all have their value, no doubt, as an anthropologist, my talk today will focus on what anthropology has to offer to our understanding of the spread of mobile phones throughout the Global South. So I may be preaching to the converted, especially given the fact that, I suppose, ethnography, which is often considered the hallmark of anthropology, has become particularly fashionable in recent years, even in more quantitatively inclined disciplines. But my talk departs from the more technical, methodological concerns to offer instead an epistemological investigation into the ways in which we produce knowledge on mobile communication. And I think such a reflection is particularly important given that the phone is so often cast as a catalyst for change, not only by the proponents of ICT4D, but also often by users themselves. Though I should say that many actually see the phone more as a double-edged sword or as a necessary evil, which is how many of my Mozambican informants would say, rather than as a panacea, but as a catalyst for change, no less. At first, the eager adoption of mobile phones throughout the North Atlantic world triggered varying degrees of moral panic, as many anticipated the damaging social impacts of the unprecedented growth of technologically mediated interaction. And the widespread adoption, I'm talking about the Western world at the moment, was that mobile phones would have a detrimental effect on real face-to-face communication. Of course, many were quick to challenge such claims by showing how, actually in diverse settings, it was quite opposite. And mobile-mediated communication helped invigorate and expand social networks. And some tackled the issue from a more theoretical angle by dissociating mediation from technology, and thus questioning the very idea that technologically mediated interaction was in any way more mediated than other forms of interaction. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Miller and Horst's introduction to this great edited volume, Digital Anthropology, that just came out. Or also, this is a point Bolstorff makes in his book on Second Life. And both are indebted to Erving Goffman, I suppose, who was one of the first to theorize the mediated nature of social interaction. Now, what these authors remind us is that social interaction, including face-to-face interaction, is always mediated by social and cultural frames, whether we like it or not. In fact, Miller and Horst even compare this moral panic with concerns that followed the spread of money. And I think it's quite a compelling analogy if we accept that money, in their words, has always been virtual to the degree that it extends the possibilities of abstraction. But of course, it's not of today that new technologies trigger moral anxiety. For example, Fisher in his work on the introduction of landlines to American households showed how there was much concern and how the phone may have been welcomed by the housebound housewives, but it caused much concern from the husband's perspective, who suddenly lost control of their wives' activities. And I suppose there's something about space-time compression that excites and frightens at the same time. It can be emancipatory for some, like the housewife, but particularly threatening for others, in this case, the poor husband. Now, moving to the global south, when the phone started spreading in different parts of the global south just over a decade ago, it came with promises that appeared to trump all these concerns. And the phone was not only seen as answering a real communication need in places where landline infrastructure would remain poorly developed. Many also believed that the phone would help developing countries, leapfrog stages of development. And I won't go into the ICT4D paradigm or neither into the rather well-rehearsed critique of it. But I just want to say that, again, the response was to qualify these concerns or this paradigm empirically by showing how in specific cases, actually, and I suppose it's the but that John was alluding to earlier. But alongside this debate on the transformative potential of mobile phones, the spread of the technology also triggered a moral response from the ground. And particularly vocal in this respect were several African intellectuals who saw the phone as kind of threatening and potentially resulting in a loss of cultural identity. Some, such as Mazruri, were highly critical in suggesting that many Africans were enamored by new communication technologies, and I'm quoting him here, very often for all the wrong reasons. I've often heard echoes of this interpretation in Mozambique, as hinted at by Takdir, and as I'll discuss further in the second half of my talk. There's a sense that the phone helps consolidate intimate relationships that perhaps shouldn't be. In Africa, too, we find countless examples, of course, of technologically induced moral panics that precede the introduction of mobile phones. Take, for example, reactions following the expansion of road networks, which is something that Masquelier writes about in Niger. And she shows how these reactions speak of how roads, not unlike mobile phones, are, in her words, objects of both fascination and terror. Now, one thing I find particularly interesting in contrasting this kind of Western reaction to the global South, or more specifically African one, is that, like the moral panic in the West, its African version also revolves around notions of commoditization and authenticity. Yet, unlike in the Western context, where at issue is the fear of a loss of intimacy, of real face-to-face exchange, in the African case, the fear is precisely the opposite, in a way. That phone-mediated communication will encourage a surge in intimacy. So, the first question I ask is, what are the ethical underpinnings and implications of this widespread optimism towards telecommunication in the so-called developing world? And I'd say that the short answer lies somewhere within profound global inequalities, not only in terms of differential access to resources and opportunities, but also within an equally deeply entrenched developmentalist vision that tends to posit denizens of the global South as guided by necessity, as surviving, coping, rather than as just living life like we do. Or perhaps putting it in different words, as positing these users, the poor, as culturally and historically disembedded. So, for example, by celebrating creative appropriation, so the ways in which users in difficult socioeconomic contexts may overcome certain difficulties, like a good example is flashing or beeping, as it's called in some cases, or using car batteries to charge mobile phones. Such a perspective sometimes overlooks the deeper underpinnings of such creativity. Indeed, where academics or foreign observers more generally see creative appropriation, users themselves may see an embarrassing reflection of their lack of capacity. If they beep each other or climb palm trees to get better network coverage, it's essentially because of deeply entrenched global inequalities. Yet, at the same time, and this is, I think, one of the tensions that's quite interesting, is that the mobile phone, in many places, these limitations aside, is also a fundamental element in claims of membership to modernity. And a modernity that's no doubt inflected by local specificities, but also contains kind of generic common denominator expectations that are shared more or less across the global South. Competing claims to modernity spawn debates on morality and authenticity precisely because it's modernity's singularity and its pretense to being unmarked and universal that make modernity so appealing in the first place. And this is the point, of course, that James Ferguson made a few years ago, that's been picked up by various authors since. So we're faced with forces that may appear contradictory. On the one hand, so firstly we have users who are often assumed to be culturally disembedded, to be, I suppose what I mean by that is the emphasis on technical solutions to poor people who are understood generically as just needing some sort of assistance. So this is the first. Secondly, these very users themselves aspire to a kind of perhaps a generic understanding of modernity with a capital M, not an alternative version of modernity. And so in a way, kind of justifying this generic poor perspective. But thirdly, the path they borrow to reach this modernity is inevitably inflected by the socio-historical specificities of the context. I suppose I take inspiration from Janet McIntosh's work among Giriama youth, where she, in this great article, she looks at mobile linguistic practices and shows how these linguistic choices really speak of young people's attempts to reconcile their respective Giriama tradition with the profound desire to partake in globalization. And I mention her work because I think she makes a clear case for the importance to recognize the more performative dimension of mobile phone practices, along with the inequalities in which mobile epistemologies are embedded. And this brings me to my second question, which is how are we to address now the discrepancies that I've alluded to in my introduction between narratives of transformation, of rupture, and empirical reality? And I suppose this is a perennial problem, but one to which I think anthropology proposes interesting solutions. First, obviously, through methodology, namely through ethnography. Today, ethnography applies to any qualitative research that proposes to offer an in-depth understanding of specific practices in specific settings. In most cases, the key feature of ethnography is participant observation, where the researcher really inserts him or herself within the local setting, within the community, and shares his life or her life with their informants. And so the idea is that participant observation is meant to complement interviews and other forms of elicitation in a very significant way. If interviews are useful to explore specific issues and get a sense of the idioms used to discuss these issues, the layers of meaning usually only start emerging when juxtaposed to non-elicited actions and conceptualizations. So it's after all in the everyday encounters and exchanges that new media are given shape and meaning. As Volstorff puts it, unlike elicitation methods, participant observation implies a form of ethical yet critical engagement. And that's perhaps the main point I want to make in my talk, is that actually ethnography is more than a research method. It's also a perspective, which involves taking what people say seriously while remaining skeptical and situating the knowledge within respective regimes of truth before then deconstructing these different regimes of truth. So simply put, this skepticism is one informed by an understanding of power relations and of the wider historical and social context. And it's at this very juncture, by playing on these tensions between listening carefully to what people have to say, while never really taking anything at face value, perhaps even more than through its methodology, that I think, anyways, that anthropology can contribute to our understanding of new media. Or should I say, it's through the convergence between epistemology and methodology that an anthropology of new media promises to be the most insightful. And to achieve this, it's in part through a commitment to situating everyday practices within wider historical processes that we can achieve this. Because new technologies never emerge never appear in a vacuum. So it's obviously essential to situate them within the local communicative ecologies, but also in relation to the wider socio-historical context. In fact, I won't go too much in detail because I think John kind of gave a very clear understanding of the importance of history, but and of continuity and change. But one of the things that anthropologists do is they tend to highlight continuity where others would expect to find rupture. We find that people are often using new technologies, whether they're mobile phones or other forms of technologies, often to do things they were already doing previously. This attention to continuity should, however, not detract us from also recognizing the subtle and sometimes not so subtle reconfigurations that are also underway. Indeed, anthropology's strength in recognizing continuity has sometimes prevented it from making sense of social change, and I think that was clear from John's presentation. Also, it's a theme that emerged in our discussion yesterday at the workshop. It's in fact often through the introduction of new media that novel forms of sociality emerge and become imaginable. And perhaps the most compelling example is Benedict Anderson's research on the impact of print capitalism and how it contributed to the emergence of a sense of nationalism by encouraging individuals to imagine themselves as part of a national community. But if we look at more traditional media, others have also explained how letter writing fostered the imagination of new modes of privacy and personhood. And I'm thinking of Karen Barber's work in Nigeria. Now, unlike media that inspire through the dissemination of content, mobile communication broadens imaginative possibilities through connectivity, interconnectedness, and disconnection. The phone also opens up new spaces of sociality, sometimes with unexpected, even unsettling consequences. And I'll give an example of this in a moment. So I suppose I want to now turn to a more ethnographic example taken from my own research in Mozambique to kind of give you a sense of how I am approaching these wider issues in my own work, and I hope this will help you make sense of what I'm on about. I've been working in Inhambane, which is a small town in southern Mozambique, about 65,000 inhabitants. It's provincial capital, but it's quite a sleepy town just because of its geographic location. You have to turn off the national highway, and it's kind of on a peninsula. It has a particular history that I can't really go into in detail. But I've been working with young people in their 20s, more or less, so young adults, and most of them are quite educated, relatively educated. Most of them have done some secondary school education. And more specifically, I've worked in a peri-urban neighborhood of the city, so a suburb of Inhambane, known as Liberdade. And in Liberdade, just to give you a sense of the setting, the majority of the houses are built out of local material, and most households rely on petty trade, urban agriculture, social networks to make a living. But also it's a neighborhood that's changing quite rapidly, and we're seeing a growing number of houses made out of concrete, a growing number of houses now have electricity, running water, and so on. And so what follows is a condensed version of an article that was published earlier this year. And I'm using it because I think it really captures, or it really gives kind of a concrete example of what I'm trying to show in terms of anthropology's contributions to our understanding of new media. In the paper, I look at the ways in which young people in Liberdade navigate everyday uncertainty by juggling with visibility and invisibility, and the part mobile phones play in these dynamics. As others have argued, the possession of a mobile phone is basic proof of membership in a world that remains otherwise elusive for most. However, I found that in Liberdade, actually, phones were just as much about disguise than they were about display, and this will make sense in a moment. I spend most of my time with young people in their early 20s, as I said, and through our interactions, I also was in contact with their relatives and their kin and intimate networks. When I first met them in mid-2006, which is when I started my doctoral research, they were still waiting to reap the benefits of the post-war economy, to feel globalization, as they put it. Most were living with relatives, often in women-headed households, and the men generally struggled to foresee the day where they could actually move out and found an independent household. Many were in fact successful in delaying children. They were still studying and they took it quite seriously. In contrast, a few of the young women had made it past their 20th birthday without getting pregnant, and a number were second-generation single mothers. Now, Like other young people throughout the global south, they were not only grappling with the widening rift between the expected and the possible, they were also contending with some of the contradictions that emerged from expansive opportunities, the fact that they're studying and they have certain expectations when they leave secondary school, and declining opportunities in the formal sector. And such contradictions were compounded in a social environment not only scarred by an abrupt transition from a wartime economy of extreme scarcity to one characterized by a sudden influx of modern consumer goods, but also one in which there is an insidious colonial legacy in which the realization of self was tightly connected to consumption and display. And I should say, for those of you who are not familiar with Mozambique's recent history, well, I suppose it was a Portuguese colony and only gained independence in 1975, like other Portuguese colonies in Africa. Following a war of liberation that was then followed by a brutal civil war that only ended in 1992, and which also overlapped with a socialist modernization project of the 1980s. So whereas information and communication technologies have contributed to the erosion of privacy in some settings, their impact in other contexts is more ambiguous. And in places like Liberdade, where privacy is scarce and where most people have passed from no phone to mobile phone, telecommunication opens up new spaces of sociality. In other words, mobile communication transforms its experiences in space, not only in terms of space-time compression, of course it does that as well, but also by providing individuals with more latitude to do certain things away from the purview of passers-by, relatives, and partners. More specifically, mobile communication helps address some of the social contradictions that Mozambique's post-socialist, post-war economy has exacerbated by allowing individuals to engage in various pursuits with some degree of discretion. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that the phone opens up the space where people can do certain things more discreetly. Now, of course, no one's entirely oblivious to what goes on under the cover of text messaging. So the wife might know that her husband cheats on her, the father might realize that his daughter is involved with older men, the sister is aware that her brother hustles every now and then, but the discretion granted by mobile communication, I argue, has, even despite its imperfections, fundamental implications in this context. And I situate the phone within what I call a wider arsenal of pretense, an amalgam of technologies from fences to the use of obscurity at night that are designed to help conceal and falsify make-believe. And since discretion is particularly valued in intimate pursuits, I focus on the integration of mobile phones into the intimate economy, which is a sphere that has attracted much attention in recent years. Usually under the rubric of transactional sex, which is understood as a coping strategy that young women use to get by exchanging sexual services, usually with older men, for material gain. Okay, so let me give you a sense of the politics of pretense, as I call it, by introducing the Cabrals. Okay, the Cabrals live on one of the small hills of Liberdade. It's a family I've been working with for a number of years. And like all the yards in the neighborhood, theirs is kept impeccably tidy and is swept every day at sunrise. Lush flower beds, neatly lined with empty bottles, deflect attention from the sleeping quarters that are slowly rotting away. The household is headed by Julia, a placid woman in her 50s who works as a civil servant in the city center and who supplements her income by selling vegetables. Of her 7 children, only the three younger ones, still live with her. Her 2 sons, both in their early 20s, are struggling to find regular employment despite holding secondary school diplomas. Now, I'm more interested in their sister, who, like other young women her age, at the time the snapshot was taken, she was 19. She wakes up at the crack of dawn to sweep the yard before heading for school. Household chores keep her busy in the afternoons, and she's responsible for fetching water at the local tap on the road and cooking the family meals. Now, shortly before I met her, Sandra started hanging out at a nearby bar to watch the Brazilian telenovelas that run every evening. And before long, she got into the habit of sleeping out and returning only the following day. Now, at first, and you have to understand, there's no father figure in this household, so the older brothers are in charge of kind of maintaining order. They don't have much to back up their authority because they're both unemployed. So at first, the brothers were furious, and they warned that if she carried on behaving this way, she'd never marry, and they tried to beat her, but to no avail, as Sandra kept going out at night. Then one day, one of them, Sambo, mentioned that their older sister also used to do the same when she was still living with them a few years earlier. But he said, at least she had the decency to come back in time to sweep the yard, which means before anyone could take notice. And that she always cooked a nice breakfast for everyone. So he described Sandra, this current sister, in contrast as lacking respect. In other words, though the brothers openly disapproved of their sister's loose mores, it was her lack of discretion and also her selfishness that truly unnerved them. It was not so much what she did as how she did it that they found unacceptable. Now, a closer look at local politics of respect clarifies this emphasis on pretense. In Liberdad, social worth is largely gauged by how respectful one is, and in fact, discretion and respect are often used interchangeably. So people say, esconder respeito, so if you hide something, you're being respectful. The relationship between concealment and respect is particularly vivid in intimate affairs. So for example, another saying is, one who conceals does so because he or she cares, which is something women often have cynically comment on. In fact, a good partner is not necessarily a faithful one, but rather a discreet one. And those in committed relationships are encouraged to find lovers far away from home, to do everything they can not to be discovered. Complaining about her womanizing husband, Benedita put it this way. She said, our fathers also used to have lovers, but at least they got them far away. Now our husbands go with the neighbors. So, in short, there's this idea that respect tends to rest on one's ability to maintain appearances, to play with facades, falsify, embellish a reality. And in recent years, the phone has become a vital cog in this wider arsenal of pretense. As another place where many rely on social networks to make ends meet, of course, in Mozambique as well, telecommunication lubricates pre-existent redistribution networks and allows those at the receiving end to play a more active role in the process. But I argue that just as importantly, it's through the creation of these virtual spaces of sociality where lovers can meet and coordinate encounters that the phone really helps address this expansion of privacy and resolve some of the contradictions that people are facing in such a changing context. So if the phone acts as a conspicuous proof of membership to this globalized world that people are so concerned about over there, given the precarious financial situation in which many find themselves, young adults tend to have actually more to hide than to display, whether it's what they do or what they lack. And so I'm trying to position the emergence of the phone in this context, also in relation to perhaps wider transformations especially in the peri-urban areas of Inhambane, where a lot of people resettled following the wars in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And so in a context where people live in close proximity, also in a context where most things happen outdoors, in the yard, so people cook, wash their clothes, talk, eat, outside, often in the pure view of neighbors and passers-by. Now, this high visibility also renders concealment all the more crucial to harmonious social relations. But there are, of course, different ways to evade this fascination with the neighbor's life. And as I mentioned earlier, one tactic is to move about under the cover of darkness. Okay? And this has been reported in many places in Africa where, unlike the day, which is a period of surveillance, constraints, and restriction, the night comes with freedom, albeit often coupled with some degree of danger. But nighttime is commonly associated with thieves, witches, and lovers. So this is part of this arsenal of pretense that I'm trying to build, in which the phone fits. The erection of tall fences is also part of this. So most households will spend considerable amounts of money and energy in building these 6 feet tall fences around their properties. And well, I can't really go into the detail, but I see these fences as part of this display disguise dynamic where fences are a grand act of display because you're showing you have the resources to build them, but also a grand act of disguise and also connected to the control of women who spend most of their time in the confines of the yard. Now, so in a sense, as an essentially masculine attempt, albeit a rather clumsy one, to control women. Now some, of course, also use mobile phones as a digital leash, to borrow Ling's term, in an attempt to control their partners. But the ease with which one can lie over the phone is not lost on anyone, obviously. The phone, how it lies, I often heard people say before adding something along the lines of, your wife can answer, yes, I'm at home, when in reality she's just out and about. And so I suppose the point I want to make is that in many cases the phone may facilitate the control of individuals, but more often than not, what I found is that women are actually using mobile phones precisely to transcend male oversight. And to understand that, I suppose I want to position everyday life in Inhambane within the more kind of the part patriarchal authority plays in the region. Now, in contemporary Libertad, patriarchal authority remains the main model of authority. It guides gender relations, justifies double standards, such as the idea that, unlike men, women are not supposed to have more than one intimate partner. It also dictates normative behavior, especially regarding the movement, or the freedom of movement of women, and the way in which women are expected to justify their coming and goings to the male members of their household, and also to minimize the time they spend out and about. But there's a sense, however, and I've already started alluding to this, that in recent years the movement of women has kind of slipped away from male control. And overall, most of the parents, especially that I spoke with, felt that they had little control over their children. And so there's a sense that the spread of mobile phones, ICT, has coincided with a redefinition of intimate relationships and broader gender and generational hierarchies. A redefinition that mobile phone practices both index and shape in significant ways. Now, I want to argue that the dissolution of patriarchy may not be a new phenomenon. Okay, this is something that's been going on for a number of years now, and I mentioned already that we're seeing second generation single mothers, for example, so that certainly speaks to that. But what's going on today is that not marrying is not necessarily a misfortune for these young women, and that increasingly women are finding ways to remain uncommitted precisely because they realize they can have a much more interesting lifestyle if they keep their options open. Women are borrowing from various repertoires to construct new ideas of femininity, romance, and purpose. And as I mentioned, a number of them have come to the conclusion that they could really lead more fulfilling lifestyles, more fulfilling lives by engaging in relationships with various men, and have developed crafty ways to use their sexuality to their advantage. Now, in Libertad, women's access to resources in these intimate relationships rests on a sexual ethos according to which seduction involves the display and distribution of resources. And in recent years, phones have come to play a fundamental role in these processes. Phones not only make the pursuit of intimate partners logistically simpler, suddenly people are more easily available, they also make it a lot more discreet. And this has fundamental implications regarding respectability and the accumulation of lovers and suitors, and the overall smooth management of intimate networks. Women can also be more unrelenting in their requests. And an example I usually give is of this young friend of mine who wanted to make a demonstration once, and she said, okay, look, I'm going to send a beep to this guy who has a crush on me. And 5 seconds later, the man in question rang her, and she said, oh, I don't have bread and I'm hungry and so on. And about an hour later, the man was at the door with a bag of bread. And so not only had he paid for the bread, but he'd also paid for the phone call asking for the bread. And she had done this as a demonstration. She said, men think that with patience, they win victories. So just the idea that, I suppose the point of this example is also to show how, because of this technologically mediated interaction, women also gain the ability to sometimes receive without necessarily giving, to kind of subvert this chain of reciprocity. So there's a question of efficiency in the management of these relationships and a question of discretion. Let me give you another example. When I met Bella, she was involved with this violent man who used to beat her up and cheat on her, and then he would shower her with gifts and beg for her forgiveness. She later left him for an educated man who she described as romantic and respectful. And by this she meant that she never saw him with another girl or found anything suspicious on his mobile phone. But her new boyfriend had a problem. He never gave her anything. As she put it, if you see me wearing nice clothes, it's quite obvious that it's not my unemployed father who bought them for me, but my boyfriend doesn't ask me where I got them from. After a few months of seeing each other, he still hasn't given me anything. He never asks me where I get my perfume from. He compliments me on my hairdo, but he doesn't ask me how I pay for it. She concluded, at least he gets upset whenever I receive a text message in his presence. And so, although a respectful man, Bella's new boyfriend was not a good provider. And as she carefully monitored his activity, she said, I usually go through his phone when he's taking a bath. She used her own phone to discreetly manage relationships with other men who could allow her to buy perfume and nice clothes and go to the hair salon. Like other young women in Libertad, Bella found that the only way she could start fulfilling some of the desires she had was by multiplying intimate partners. However, instead of having these men knock on her door for everyone to see, she used her phone to logistical advantage. And now, this may seem obvious, but on top of that, what happens is that, of course, the boyfriend is aware of all this. He's not oblivious to where she's acquiring all these nice things. But because this is done discreetly through mobile telecommunication, then suddenly the man, the boyfriend in this case, can feign ignorance, okay? He can pretend he doesn't know because it's not in his face. So the phone allows young women to better juggle what would otherwise be irreconcilable ideals of respectability with economic emancipation. So I suppose my point is that the discretion afforded by mobile phone communication is no doubt imperfect, and I've written elsewhere about how intercepted phone calls and text messages can often cause intimate conflicts. But although it's a patchy answer, this newfound discretion nonetheless has important implications in the context that I've been describing. For instance, the Cabral household directly benefits from, not to say relies on, its young women's nocturnal activities or intimate networks. But for everyone to sit around the table and enjoy the nice breakfast, there has to have been an effort at concealing the source of this nice breakfast. So in short, the phone helps preserve what I call, building on Tausig, this unpleasant secret about the workings of the post-war economy, with its dependencies and interdependencies that encourage young girls like Bella, like Sandra, to exchange sexual favors for material gain and to accumulate intimate partners on an unprecedented scale. The phone therefore helps reproduce this epistemology of ignorance in which, and I'm quoting Michael Tausig here, individuals know what not to know in order to be. So, as young women navigate intimate networks, they also manipulate regimes of truth and subvert pre-existing categories. No one in Liberdad I spoke with denied that there always were women willing to exchange sexual favors for material gain and that had multiple partners. But many believe that mobile phones were amplifying the trend. Okay? With mobile phones, it's no longer just a game, it's a sport, which is an expression people often use in reference to anything done in excess, is how young men put it to me. Now, the blurring of boundaries between what I once believed to have been discrete categories of women was described as particularly problematic by those who struggled to navigate their way among these different women. As Inocencio, a young man in his early 20s, explained, he said, there are two categories of girls to marry and girls to play with. But the problem is that girls these days are really clever with their mobile phones and all, and we end up not knowing which is which. So I think when we situate such a comment within the wider socio-historical context that I've been kind of presenting in my talk, such a statement can be understood not so much as a true reflection of reality, but rather as speaking of profound moral anxieties in a context where clearly patriarchal authority is under pressure. I think, and I'm concluding here, I think we can probably agree that information and communication technologies are redefining the ways in which individuals everywhere imagine, experience, as well as navigate material and social spaces. But I also think that the specificities of these redefinitions deserve our attention, if only because they're likely to spawn more profound, more durable transformations, I would think, than those instigated through top-down mobile development initiatives. And so I think it's by encouraging us to look at users as individuals with a particular socio-historical background, to look at phone practices in their own right, but also phone practices as a window, as a lens into wider social processes that anthropology can really contribute to our understanding of new media. So by offering not only a methodology, but also a certain sensibility.